So one of the things that and part of building these relationships, right, and building a basis of trust to be doing work together is important in movement spaces. But I've heard a lot about the distrust of institutions, right? And so what are the things that can you comment on how that plays out in movement spaces and what you've seen, and what can institutions, whether it's a congregation or a denomination, do to build that trust in?
Great question. So I've been thinking a lot about what are sort of the toxics and tonics in movement culture, and they mirror some of the things that we see engaged in the questions of the denomination, and some of that relates to institutions, right? I mean, I think that some of this, the my generation question is kind of interesting, because I'm either the oldest millennial that exists or the youngest Gen X. I'm right there. I was born in 1981. So
all right, and I'm right between the boomers and Gen X.
Yeah, so you're right. You're right there.
I'm on the boundary too.
Right. As the cuspers, I think, we really come by this distrust of institutions honestly, and I think the boomers need to really understand that. Like, we're being told we have to pay into Social Security, and we're being told we'll never get any back from it, right? We're being told that, the schools, there's not going to be decent schools for our kids very, very soon. We're watching everything get privatized around us, from water to air to whatever. And this hits people who are structurally marginalized particularly hard. Folks of color, LGBTQ people, poor people, etc. Folks with disabilities. Like, why should we feel anything but cynical about these institutions, particularly looking at what's happening with the United States government right now, right? Like, actually, the danger is that we're just absorbed into cynicism. So that's real. And I also think, and I think about this with some of my friends who are either running for public office or they're working on campaigns. A couple of my friends have really talked about what does it mean to go from being a generation of movement leaders, for all of us who are really good at polarizing and resisting and speaking out and really naming the critique, to think about what would we do if we're governing. If we're governing our city governments, our state governments, big, business ventures, like all of these sort of things that we were all like, poison, we were like at a different point in our life. And to think about, how do we not just answer what's wrong with the city of Phoenix, but where would we like to be in 10 years? And what are our top level aspirational, values rooted prospects? What are the actual policies, right? And that's part of my excitement about ideas like the Green New Deal, et cetera, is that the Green New Deal is many different things. People can have all kinds of thoughts about the idea, but it's also about engaging generations of people under 50 into the idea of like believing in institutions again. I looked at a picture of what the high-speed light rail system would look like, potentially under the Green New Deal, right? Mm-hmm. That is getting a lot of young people excited about institutions, whether they know it or not, whether we know it or not, because that takes institutions. That takes a Department of Transportation that can make that happen. And it's going to push us, right? I would say that the love of institutions that sometimes has come up for folks in different places, and it often is, a lot of people have a trajectory where they're not in institutions earlier in their life, and then at later points in their life they are, and that is not always true across race and class for sure. I think that it is important to remember that so many of the most hopeful things we have now is because folks were willing to disrupt institutions and willing to say, we want to talk about the military-industrial complex, we want to talk about police, we want to talk about ICE, and, even things like Amazon or the tech titans. It's like, wait a minute, Facebook, wait a minute. That's the disruption that some of our generation has been willing to do. So we've also seen that work for us. Now, just because it works for us, it doesn't mean it works on rinse and repeat forever, but it's very uncomfortable sometimes to be disruptive, but it has been important because we've reached a point where we could no longer accept the status quo, and we actually not only couldn't accept it, but had some goals some tactics for how to move it, right? So it's a both and. Again, it's about seeing perspective and then figuring out, what are our goals now? And to be frank, is it disrupting sometimes? Is it disrupting and shaking up and then taking over? Is it taking over? Like, there's different approaches, but to me, it's actually not about loyalty to the tactic, but to the goal, you know?
And to the values that you're
Mhm.
upholding
While you get to the goal,
while
exactly.
you get to the goal. Yeah.